Hi guys, this is Jim with Performance Technologies again, back with the final part of our 300ZX Twin Turbo Teardown series. This will be part number 4. We'll be taking this stuck crank gear off today and showing you several techniques to try to get one off. As you may recall, this gear was completely locked onto the snout of the crankshaft. Nothing that I did seemed to want to move it, prying on the back of the oil pump or on the gear itself showed any signs of movement. That's not unusual for these. So we'll go through, well, in this video we're going to go through several techniques, because it really is a real bear to get off of there. First thing we're going to do, or door number 1, is to use a nice sharp punch. Get some divots punched into the gear so that we can locate our drill bits, and they need to be straight across from each other, so you can use a standard style straight puller. Then we're going to drill these out to accept 1/4 by 20 threads. You do need a nice sharp punch to do this. They're cheap and easy to find. When you're drilling, just try to keep the bit as straight as possible. It doesn't have to be straight, but once you get it started in there, you need to continue on the same path. In other words, don't be trying to jiggle the drill up and down guessing where it's straight. If you're already cutting, just keep going. As long as it's not too far off or you're not getting close to the crankshaft, don't worry about it. What I do was space these out so that they're just about in the middle between the crankshaft and the inner part of the gear cuts on this timing belt drive gear. And right now I have sort of a equipment malfunction. I don't have the collar on there right. The back of that tap is a square drive. And I didn't have it quite seated right. Now we're good. As you're tapping, you'll start running into more and more resistance as you go. You don't want to just keep trying to tighten. You want to stop and back the tap out occasionally. Back it out a turn or 2 or 3 until it gets free, and then screw it back down and continue cutting new threads. Remember, you're cutting brand new threads into steel. That gear is steel. It's not very good quality steel, but it's still steel. Same thing for the other side of the gear. We've drilled 2 holes directly across from each other. And as you saw, I just used the puller that I'm going to be using to get them lined up and punched and then drilled. It's a labor-intensive process, but it's not hard. There's nothing difficult about it. It just takes some time and some patience. You don't want to get too wild while you're threading holes, or you'll snap that tap into the hole, and that's a real mess. They're hardened steel, and you can't really drill them out. You just got to kind of start over in a different place with a new tap. Okay, our holes are tapped. Now we've got some 1/4 inch by 20 bolts we're going to run in here, and I've got hardened steel washers on the head end. Just going to run those down finger tight, and then we'll tighten them with a ratchet and a 7/16 socket. New threads always feel strange when you're running the first bolt into them. They always feel tight. That's normal. Nothing that a ratchet won't take care of. Okay, now we're going to sort of tighten up this puller and see if everything is aligned. You want the bolts driven in equal lengths, so that when the puller's on there, it's flat across the face of whatever you're pulling. So the screws need to be down equal distance. We've tapped into those holes about a 1/2 inch in. We didn't completely bottom out the tap. Okay, now we're going to put some pressure on this thing and see if we can pop this gear off here. Normally at this point, with 1/4 inch by 20 bolts and a puller, you'll see this pulley slowly start moving out. It'll usually pop once, and then it'll slowly start pulling towards you. And it gets easier as it gets closer to the end of the shaft. This one doesn't seem to be moving very much. In fact, if you look at that bolt towards the bottom, you'll see that it's pulling through the puller. It's destroying my fancy hardened steel washer and pulling it through the puller. So this one's on there. So it's time to give up. Get some new spacing devices on there. Those washers have wrapped themselves around the head. Okay, so now I've got some pulling spacers on there, and I dare it to do that again. These are just things that you're going to run into. Again, we're aligning it so that it's flat across the face. The bolts are in equal distance. And now we'll try this again. Yeah, this is simple. Well, maybe not, since that bolt just pulled the threads. Yep, kind of bent up the bolt, pulled the threads out of the gear. So, now we go to door number 2. And that means drilling the holes larger, and this time we'll be using a 5/16 by 24 bolt to pull this thing off with. The more surface area, more pulling force. Same thing, we drilled the holes in the same location, just drilled those existing holes oversized to, I think was it 1964, so I don't remember the drill size for 5/16, but you can look at your tap guide and it'll tell you. Now we're just going to tap them to 5/16 by 24. Same as we did before. Make sure that the tap is as straight as you can eye it, and it will self-center. I've also blocked the crank with a piece of wood between the crank throw and the engine block so that it doesn't try to run away. Also, you may have already noticed, I forgot to mention it, I have put the mains back on because shortly we're going to be turning the engine over, and I don't want the crankshaft hanging by the oil pump and rear main seal. So, another set of bolts, another set of hardened steel washers, and we're going to try this again. Draw those bolts down to where they're in equal lengths. Run the center part of your puller in, and as it starts to get tight, you'll be able to see whether it's flat across the face or not, and you can tighten your bolts or loosen them or whatever you need to do to get them in equally. So you've got it as flat as possible so that it's generating the same force on each side of that gear. So far, so good. Just pull slowly. As I said, generally you'll hear sort of a pop or cracking sound as it starts to come loose, and then that gear will start to move. But not this time. Something that I should have mentioned last time, the way to tell a JDM engine from a stock engine, the JDM engines have that oil pressure sending unit right there. They're on the passenger side and they hang straight down. On the standard engines that came in your car, the oil pressure sending unit is on the oil filter adapter and it sticks out at an angle. So on the Japanese engines, it's on the driver's side. On the American engines, it's on the passenger side. This is, as you saw there, a JDM replacement engine. Now, this is door number 3. Taking a grinder and directly over the holes that we drilled, that we tried to pull it with, we're going to grind a slot over those holes and into those holes. You don't want to go down to the crankshaft. We just want to go down into the holes. And then we're going to use, here I'm using a air hammer. with a hardened chisel bit on it. And I just want to try to crack that gear. And I'll do this on both sides. Sometimes the gear will just fall apart at that point. Other times, not so much. It still hasn't cracked, so I'm going to use a hand chisel. Something important here, try not to put force into the crankshaft snout by beating down towards the crankshaft snout. Try to keep all of your force going back linearly. Whoops. Bye-bye. Some of these engines have steel cranks, some of them have cast cranks. If you put a lot of force into the nose of the crank, you can damage it, you can crack it, you can put micro fractures in it. You want to keep any force going the length of the crankshaft, not towards the center of the crankshaft. Now we've flipped it over, turned the crank 180 degrees, and we're doing the other side. Same thing, just cutting a slot into that bolt hole that we drilled earlier. And there is method to this, you'll see here in a minute. Be careful while you're grinding. You don't want to go far enough to hit the crankshaft itself. You just want to go through that hole and not through the entire gear. Same thing, we're going to use the air hammer, see if we can spread that gear and get it to crack. And that ain't happening. When all else fails, get violent with it. There we go. Okay, we cracked the gear. Now, we turn the gear 90 degrees, and this is important. We're going to cut straight down into the gear. You want this cut, this forward cut. We're going to make actually two cuts. The front cut needs to be as vertical as possible. You want it to be as straight a face as possible because we're going to use a set of pullers and they need to be able to grab a straight face to pull. So we're going to grind in a slot, relatively deep and relatively wide. This is going to be about 1.5 inches across, and it's going to be probably 1/4 inch deep. Then we're going to grind a second slot behind it towards the block, about 1/4 inch away. And it's going to be the same depth and the same width. Then we're going to flip the crank 180 degrees and do the same thing on the other side so that the slots that we're grinding are directly across from each other, just like we did with the bolt holes. Same process again. You want to go about the same distance back from the face of the crank gear and go about the same depth as the first one. And be sure to keep it as straight down as possible. You want a vertical surface there to pull against. You want it far enough back from the front of that crank gear so that you've got a lot of surface area to pull against also. You want a thick area to pull against. Now we'll do the second one, and it's the same way, about 1/4 of an inch wide, same depth, about the same width. And after they're cut, like that, now we're just going to take our steel chisel and knock out the little wall between those two cuts. You want a sharp chisel to do this. Now we're just going to dress it a little bit to kind of smooth up the bottom of that little trench that we just dug. There'll be a little ridge in the center that we're going to get rid of here. Using a chisel to get that centerpiece out is just a lot faster and easier than to try to grind a little piece that's sticking up. Now we've got 2 1/4 inch wide slots that are about 1/2 inch back. And we're going to use a puller to try to get in there, and nope, it's not going to get in there. Didn't really think it would. Hey, you never know. So, since I don't give a damn about this oil pump, since oil pumps always get replaced with an overhaul, I don't care about cutting it up. Remember, we're not hurting the engine. This is all that front mounted oil pump. It's a easily replaceable part, so I don't give a damn about it. That belt guide is what's in the way. It runs underneath that timing belt drive gear. So we're going to make it go bye-bye. Whoa, big fella. Okay, now we should have plenty of clearance for our jaws. And we do. So we put the bolt back in so we've got something to push against. The bolt in the crank, that is. Tighten it up by hand. See if those jaws try to slip out or not. If they do, you can take your grinder and try to flatten them up some more. They have to be as flat as possible for those jaws to grab. And instead of using fancy tools, I'm just going to use vice grips. Okay, we saw that the gear was cracked, so this should be simple stuff. But is it? Remember, this is the 3rd attempt to get this damn thing off of here. Did you hear the pop? Look, it's moving. How about that? Simple, right? Imagine trying to do this while it's in the car. Okay, also notice that I did not put the big washer on the crank bolt. The bolt head is actually a little smaller than the crankshaft snout, so we don't have to worry about anything hanging on it. So I just don't put the washer on and just drive the bolt in. Looky there. One recently destroyed crank drive gear. And look at the rust on that damn thing. Okay, we're going to pull the mains back off, since we can now get the crank out. That is a rusted up old sumbitch. Generally the first step, the 1/4 inch by 20, works like a champ. In this case, not so much. Okay, oil pump is gone. Only thing holding that crankshaft in is the rear oil seal casing. There's the inside of that gear. You can see all the rust. Other side. And there's the slots that we cut. Focus. Okay, I have all 4 bolts out that retain that rear main seal. It's in its own bracket, casing, whatever, that holds it onto the back of the engine. The rear main seal is a 1-piece seal. And of course it won't come out because there's a big hairy bolt that belongs to the engine stand. But it will after the crank is gone. Now we just lift that crankshaft out of there. Just straight up. Put it someplace safe. Okay, now we got a good view of the oil squirters in these blocks. These squirt oil onto the underside of the piston, both for cooling and for lubrication, but it's mainly for cooling. It's for cooling the tops of the pistons. Here's that number 2 cylinder that I promised I'd show you. The skirts on both sides of the piston are pretty chewed up. Probably because somebody changed plugs, the seals weren't working well or something like that, and trash got down in there when they pulled the spark plug. You can see the cylinder is pretty scarred up as well. That's the number 2 cylinder. The outer side. The inner side is just about as bad. As you can see there. Okay, that's all for this video, and that's all for this teardown. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope that it wasn't too boring. Next time, I think we'll be doing the transmission out of that 3000 GT all-wheel drive. As always, have fun, drive safe, and we'll see you guys later.